tax, I do some tax issues, but believe me, you have not lived until you sit in a room full of, not necessarily tax lawyers, but the actual tax people, the accountants, and they start throwing out these three-letter acronyms that you have no idea what they're talking about, and they talk about the IRS coming in auditing, and have you had your audit for this year, and what's going on. So I probably would suggest also that you probably learn a little bit about tax so that you at least have a little knowledge about what they're talking about. So anyway, the Aerospace Industry Association, we were basically founded in 1919, a few years after the birth of flight. Right now we have what we call 142 regular members. Those are the, what we call prime contractors, and then we have what we call associate members, who are basically, a lot of times they are suppliers to the regular members. They work on commercial aviation, avionics, to manned and unmanned defense systems, space technologies, and satellite communications. And what I thought I'd start with kind of like, what is counterfeit product? Why would somebody manufacture counterfeit product? What kind of products are counterfeited? And then some statistics. So if we start with the law, which is always like a really good place to start, we start with the definition of counterfeit. This is from the 18 U.S.C. 2320. This is on the criminal and the criminal code. And basically, whoever intentionally traffics or attempts to traffic in goods or services and knowingly uses a counterfeit label, knowing that the counterfeit mark has been applied, and the use of which is to likely cause confusion. Unfortunately, we have, in working in some of this area, we have people that are trying to expand the definition of counterfeit, which I'm like, no, these are, a lot of them are engineers, they're non-lawyer people trying to tell the rest of industry what a counterfeit good is, as opposed to the intellectual property rights attorneys who are saying, no, you're basically looking at a trademark that you're violating. The counterfeit goods are the ones that are, like you call counterfeit. If it's a DVD or music or optical media, it's called pirated. So we're not talking anything on pirated materials today. There's a lot you can find online about that. And then the 2320 also includes, like if there's serious harm or death occurs, then you can add additional. You have forfeiture and destruction of the property, and then restitution. And then the 2320 also includes definitions on what a counterfeit mark is, trafficking, and financial gain. So basically, here's what we have: counterfeit mark. Basically, the one that I always like to use is the use of which is likely to cause confusion, to cause mistake, or to deceive the person that is buying the product. One thing that did happen is up until 2006, until the Stop Counterfeiting and Manufactured Goods Act, which was signed by then President George W. Bush, if I had counterfeit product over here, and in a drawer over here or a cabinet, I had labels, what else? Anything that could be used to be put on the product, because at some point they would keep them separate. And until 2006, if you found those separately, there's nothing they could do. So in 2006, they changed it and said just by the mere fact that you have the counterfeit trademark labels, you're guilty. And then they also strengthened the penalties for counterfeiters, ordered the destruction of all counterfeit products, requires convicted counterfeiters to turn over their profits and any equipment used in their operations. And that was kind of interesting because I actually did go to that signing. It was kind of a small signing. But as I was saying, industry is trying to expand the definition of counterfeit. And actually, when we were first starting to work in this area, I went to the Chamber of Commerce, who has a group on counterfeiting and piracy, and I said, what's the definition of counterfeit? And the answer was, it depends upon which industry you're talking to. So I'm like, well, that's not very helpful, because I would think that everybody would have the same definition, because if every industry has a different definition, it's not going to be consistent across. So the Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry, Security, Office of Technology Evaluation did a survey. And this is basically what they were using as their definition. They basically said, if it's an unauthorized copy, if it doesn't conform to the original component manufacturer design, model, and/or performance standards, it's counterfeit. If it's not produced by the OCM or is produced by unauthorized contractors, it's counterfeit. If it's an off-specification, defective, or used OCM product sold as new working, it was counterfeit. And if it has incorrect or false markings and/or documentations. And I would argue that quite a few of those are not really counterfeit product. I could argue that this off-specification, defective, or used, sold as new or working, that's basically fraud. That's not counterfeit. It's just, I've taken this product, I've cleaned it up, and I'm not trying to tell you that it's new. It's not counterfeit. It still has the original trademark on it. Not produced by the OCM, possibly, maybe if you had a trademark license. Unauthorized contractors, it's possibly, it doesn't conform to the original. I could probably argue that that's not counterfeit. But the unauthorized copy probably would be. In fact, I just found out today, Europe is now looking at, with regards to medicine, it's not just, they're separating it. There's falsified medicine and there's counterfeit medicine. Counterfeit medicine will deal with if you're violating intellectual property rights. Falsified is, you're not dealing with violation of intellectual property rights. I think that's really splitting a line, and I think it could cause confusion. Yes?
We read about in World Trade and World IT class that a lot of medicines transported from India to Brazil
right.
go through a trade in Europe, and they say it's counterfeit.
Right.
So what's the argument for that?
I think they're trying, there's a lot of that, and I know that even there's some countries that are considering generics or counterfeits. I think Europe was arguing, well, you're sending it through here. The company does not really allow that to be sent to Brazil, so therefore we're going to confiscate it. And I know there's been some arguments on that. And I know with the generics, there's been a lot of talk of saying, you know, that's counterfeit medicine because they're generics. So there's a lot of argument around, particularly with regards to medicine, because the World Health Organization is quite large in this area, and then the EU is jumping in also. So I think there's a lot of splitting of hairs with regards to it. Yes?
Regarding patents, at least, there is that exception of in transit.
Right.
Either in transit or for navigation. Isn't there a similar thing for, I know that it exists in Europe. Isn't that a similar thing for counterfeit medicine?
I think there are a lot of countries that consider counterfeit medicine really pretty bad, because there's a lot of statistics, and I'm not really concentrating because I have a lot of statistics on the counterfeit medicine that, you know, there's some talk in some places like 70% of the medicine that's available publicly is counterfeit. So, I mean, it can be really pretty bad, particularly like in developing countries. It can be very serious. You really don't know what you're buying, even from legitimate pharmacies.
No, I understand. I'm just asking specifically about the in transit.
No, they're not considering that there. Yes?
Yeah, it seemed to me that the reason they're stretching the definition of counterfeit is to pick up things that I would call fraud and deceit and so on. It's all about remedies, right? I mean, counterfeiting is criminal, and these other things have contract remedies, or they have, you know, fairly inconsequential remedies compared to going to jail. Is that what's going on, or is it something else?
I think they are stretching it, but if you really would talk to the legal prosecutors, they're not going to take that, and that's what I've been arguing. I've been working with a group of engineers and quality people to develop standards. And I keep telling them, you can't stretch these definitions. Because as far as I'm concerned, the standards organization that is selling this standard with their trademark on it and their name, I said, you're giving out wrong information. And you're basically telling companies, well, this is what a counterfeit is, and oh, by the way, you can go prosecute against the other company. If I was the defense attorney, I'd say, it's not counterfeit. Most you can sue me for is fraud, and that's a lot lower level.
Well, I thought you were talking about they were pushing statutory definitions, and the only reason I can see them do that would be to try to move it from civil liability to criminal law.
No, they're not even pushing the statutory. They're just taking the statutory and just kind of expanding it themselves.
Okay.
You have people in the industry that are trying to do that. But when we put together our white paper, this is the definition that we put together just kind of on our own. We went through our members and we put it together, and we said it's a product produced or altered to resemble a product without authority and right to do so with the intent to mislead or defraud by passing it as original or genuine. And then counterfeiting is basically the manufacture and distribution of products bearing counterfeit marks. But you also have to be aware that there's out there what is called the gray market. And I have sat in meetings where you have the trademark people and the gray market people in the same room, and there's a lot of tension in the room because these are legitimately produced product, however, they're not ending up where they are supposed to have ended up. They could have been intended for South America, but they end up in the United States, which wouldn't be bad, except there's a problem with it. Sometimes the product is made specifically for a market because they have certain like deviations from it in order to accommodate the local market, such as soaps. How the soaps are going to work will depend upon your local water. So if you have very hard water in your area and you're using a soap that's made for soft water, they're not going to react the same, and consumers are probably going to complain and say, oh, the soap isn't cleaning, it's not doing what it's supposed to do, and vice versa. So yeah, with the gray market, it's basically a diversion. And so there's a big difference between that, and the gray market people are often concerned that when you start going down the counterfeit road, their product is going to be considered counterfeit and be confiscated at the border. But if we look at aerospace, they also have another law that was passed several years ago that basically it's fraud involving aircraft or space vehicle parts. Basically, if you sell a product for either aircraft or space and you make a fraudulent representation, or you make false writing, entry, certification document, data plate, etc., you're basically committing fraud, which is what you could also argue the counterfeit product is occurring under. So, why is there counterfeit product? Number one kind of follows up from before. Extra shifts at the legitimate factory. You're the trademark licensee. You've been licensed to produce 2 shifts. Your brother-in-law decides, what if I come in on the 3rd shift and bring my own people and we'll make product? You're not licensed to. It's counterfeit. It's made the same way, but it was not approved to be made. It's counterfeit. There's outright copying. We see that all the time. Often the products that are targeted for infringement are those for which there are legitimate products, markets, or brands already well developed. Think about a lot of brands out there that have counterfeit product that have moved in, particularly like within the clothing market. It's a huge market. You see the stands all the time in Washington, D.C. and in New York City selling fake Rolexes, Louis Vuitton, footwear, etc. You're not having the people that are selling don't even have to do any marketing. Somebody else has already paid for that because they have the willing consumers want. I want that purse. I can't afford the $3,000 purse, but believe me, I can get it for $30. There's also something that the counterfeiters are getting much better at what they're counterfeiting. sometimes it becomes very difficult to tell the difference between the real and the fake. And they've even started upping the price. So instead of the original costing $1,000, and maybe you only paid $100, maybe now you're having to pay $800 for that $1,000 fake. And you think it's real because it was a good deal. It was a good sale. The reason you might be counterfeiting, you've got no research and development costs. Somebody else already spent all that money for you. You don't have to do any of it. Maybe there are high profit margins. Large potential market. A lot of people out there wanting your product. It may be also easy to establish and infiltrate distribution channels. Not everybody keeps a really good watch on where they're getting their product from. It's easy to deceive consumers. They want it. It's easy to hide operations. Particularly like if you're looking at the optical media, it's real easy. All you've got is like small pieces of equipment, make copies of. It's easy to hide it. Low risk of detection and penalty, particularly internationally and sometimes even within the US. If you also think about within the US, I believe there are 328 ports that come into that are entryways into the US. So pick your port. And if you've ever been at a port, look at those big containers coming through. I've been down in Savannah, Georgia, which is one of the large shipping ports, and I've stayed there at one of the hotels on the water, and you can see one of those container ships coming in almost every 30 minutes. And you can count the number of containers on top, and then just realize that there's even more containers underneath. Or you can see photos there at the deck. So what's your odds of getting caught by, particularly within the US, and even if you spread into other countries, low risk of customs actually catching you is very low. And finally, although this is starting to change, there's weak laws, weak enforcement, and maybe even weak sanctions. I know that in some of the cases in the US, I think the laws will say, you'll get 10 years, maybe 2, a year. Small amounts of drug dealing get larger penalties than counterfeit product. Okay, what has been counterfeited could be also changed to say what hasn't been counterfeited. In fact, those of us who deal with this all the time, it's kind of an inside joke. If you're not being copied, you probably don't have a good product. I mean, it's really sad to say, but that is basically what it comes down to. So, I mean, we have things like conduits, circuit breakers. Some of these should be really scary to people because they're things that you touch in your life every day. Circuit breakers, I worked with some of the people from the National Electrical Manufacturers Association, and they said they have tested circuit breakers that have thrown a 250-pound man across the room when it went. Think about all the housing that was built in, the last 10 years in the US? People maybe wanting to cut corners, get cheaper product, go in the houses. Like for a lot of the electrical stuff, welding electrodes. I was thinking about that today because I was like, okay, Japan's been having some serious issues in their nuclear reactors. You've welded something together. You think that electrode is what it's supposed to be. You think that that reactor is supposed to withstand so much pressure. What if they had had a counterfeit welding or electrode? I mean, these are things to think about. Automotive parts, including brake pads. What about all the semis on the road? You ever had one behind you that's coming up pretty fast? Do they have good brake pads on their cars? Some of the brake pads that they have found are basically sawdust compressed together. Electrical connectors. Ground rods is kind of an interesting one. It's the one that they put in houses covered with copper to help with lightning strikes. Well, copper has gotten pretty expensive, so they're putting real thin layers on the ground rods. So the ground rods that should last 40 years, maybe 10. Smoke alarms, that's always an interesting one. You hope that smoke alarm works. A new one that's coming out now is ball bearings. And ball bearings are used in a lot of product. If you move to like more on the commercial side, tobacco. Pesticides. I know someone that works for one of the Crop for Life organizations. They're ending up accumulating huge 50-gallon drums of pesticides that they don't know how to really destroy because they contain things in there that you don't want on crops, like cyanide, arsenic. Personal care products, if you're putting it on your skin, brushing your teeth. A couple years ago, there was a toothpaste that had, I think it was,
Glycol.
yeah, ethylene glycol. Apparel and footwear, I mean, it's interesting because you go to the meetings and you end up with the apparel and footwear people over here and everybody else is kind of like, you know, we've got the serious products. But the apparel and footwear people are starting to say, yeah, but you know what, we're starting to find that they're using materials that contain lead in the shoes. These other chemicals that you wouldn't want, like if the jeans are being processed a certain way, maybe they're ending up with some dye on there that you really don't want touching your skin. Medical devices is always a really nice, interesting one to think about when you're lying there in the hospital. And there actually, a couple years ago, there was one down in Panama. The state was giving out this medicine to the residents. Well, it turned out they were using ethylene glycol in the cough medicine that the state had approved to give out to low-income people. They gave it out thinking they were doing something very nice, and then all of a sudden people started showing up at the hospital. Motor oil, car cleaning products, sealants, and duct tape. And I have talked to one of the guys that does like sealants and everything, and they make products specifically in other countries for those countries, and they're finding their stuff is being counterfeited. If we start looking at data, because there's a lot of data out there, but the problem is it's really hard to get a number on it. And if I was going to pick data, I'd probably really be looking at Customs and Border Protection data, because this is actual hands-on data. The EU, and I'm sure other countries also collect their data. Some of it's much more difficult. And here I put up a comparison of fiscal year 2010. Their year starts October 1st through September 30th. And then fiscal 9, kind of like a lot of it stays the same. Footwear has actually gone down. The consumer electronics is going up, so which could be some concern. And then in 2010, they did 19,959 seizures. These are at the border. The domestic value was $188.1 million. But if you look at the manufacturer's suggested retail price, which is what they really look at for prosecution as well as sentencing, that was $1,413,000. And in fact, they've been doing this kind of this average. So they said if the footwear, if we did a footwear shipment, it was probably this. But for the next, starting in fiscal year 2011, they're going to actually do the manufacturer suggested retail price of each individual's shipment to really look to see what the number is. And in 2009, you can see the shipments were much less, but the domestic value was much higher, as well as the MSRP. Some of this is, although there are more seizures, they're tending to be smaller packages. The counterfeiters, I think, are realizing that containers are being targeted. So we'll send in through UPS or FedEx, will send in much smaller shipments. Maybe be less likely to be found. The other thing is they found that computer hardware that was seized last year had actually increased. One of them was last year they did a $2.3 million by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement of counterfeit military grade semiconductors. These are items that could end up in the U.S. military and other industries, possibly in national security. They're considered military grade. They're a higher cost because they've gone through additional testing, withstand extremes in temperatures and vibration. This was the first year that they reported the seizure of counterfeit bearings. So this is an area that is bearing watch. And there actually is now an association for the bearing people. They've gotten together and really said, hey, you need to pay attention to this. And products designated as consumer safety and what they consider critical technology are now 23% of all the commodities seized this year. A more exacting on a very specific area was the Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security, Office of Technology Evaluation. They surveyed 387 companies and organizations between 2005 and 2008. Basically what they wanted to look at is the impact of counterfeit electronics, and they surveyed the original component manufacturers, basically the Intels, the TIs, the AMDs. We do not know who they surveyed, they just report the results. Distributors are the ones who distribute. There's what they considered authorized distributors. They actually have a contract with the OCM. Brokers are what they usually consider independent. They don't have a contract with anyone. They oftentimes buy the remainders and then they sell it. Circuit board assemblers, and then prime subcontractors and Department of Defense agencies. So basically, the first set of data is really from the original component manufacturers, and you see from 2005 to 2008, they reported an increase in counterfeit. And then here was kind of the product resale value. It seems it doesn't matter what the product resale value is, they're hitting all targets. A lot of times they were finding used product was remarked at higher grade, and that some people say, well, maybe it's because it's an obsolete product. Survey showed it was almost evenly split out of production and in production products, like Toshiba flash drives have shown up as counterfeit. A lot of times it's because there's a huge demand on the product, can't get it, so people say, hey, let's start counterfeiting it, we can fill a need. And then that report is actually on the internet. It's about a 300-page report. They also found that all elements of the supply chain have been directly impacted by counterfeit electronics. It's a lot of lack of traceability. Record keeping by companies or organizations is very limited, and most do not know who to contact in the U.S. government regarding counterfeit parts. And I actually have a chart a little bit later to show you some of the people you can report to. There's been some other widely cited data, but GAO just kind of debunked this in April, so every time I see somebody now using this data, I'm like, you can't use it anymore. There was a 2002 FBI press release. FBI estimates that the U.S. businesses lose $200 to $250 billion in counterfeiting on an annual basis. They can't even document that. They don't even know where that came from. Customs and Border Protection in a press release and estimate that U.S. businesses lose $200 billion a year in revenue and 750,000 jobs due to counterfeits of merchandise, which is kind of interesting because CBP has nothing to do with reporting of loss of jobs. That's basically Bureau of Labor. And then the third one was that Motor and Equipment Manufacturers Association deal with the automotive industry. That U.S. automotive parts industry has lost $3 billion in sales due to counterfeit goods, and they were attributing this to the Federal Trade Commission. The GAO went to the Federal Trade Commission and said, okay, where's the data? We have no idea where it came from. So, yes?
Along those same lines, one of the things you also hear too is this connection with organized crime and counterfeiting. And I'm wondering if your experience is kind of the same thing, that there doesn't seem to be much quantifiable data available.
Actually, they know that is true.
Well, I know that they know that it's true, but it's hard to really put that kind of numbers on how involved, I think, or maybe that's still being formulated.
There's a RAND study that was like 2 years ago on film piracy, and they went through and they've listed all the gangs that they know are involved in it. You also have to realize that with counterfeit goods and organized crime, it's a lot easier than drugs. It's a lot cleaner, it's a lot safer, and people I've talked to in the industry, they're pretty well convinced that organized crime is in it, because there's money to be made. And all they've got to do is find somebody for the source of product. They don't even have to make it, and they know there are people out there to buy it. But there is a RAND study. I think if you go to the RAND site, it's on film piracy a couple years ago, and it's really interesting because they list out all the different types of gangs that they think they've actually been able to trace it to. Yes?
I actually used to work for the MPAA.
Yeah.
And I can assure you that we have had our investigators kidnapped, run off the road, shot at, held at knife point, relatives, wives, kids of our investigators kidnapped. There's no doubt that organized crime is involved.
I didn't mean to insinuate that it was not. In fact, quite
Oh, no,
the
I'm just
opposite. I
anecdotally
think it's
saying.
hard to research that information though, because like these statistics that you said, there seems to be this, you know that it's there, you know that they're involved, and this is the first, the RAND study is the first that I've heard of, but from just my own personal.
Well, one of the other ways that we would prove it is, and I don't work for them anymore, just for disclosure, but when you find a DVD replicating line or a small factory, and usually it's a legit factory that's a 9 to 5, but from 10 in the evening till 4 in the morning, it's not legit. But when you find those people who are running those lines and you bring them in and you question them, you find that they're far more willing to talk. And you know, you bring a case and you get the little people, but the way the laws are written, or at least in most of the Asian countries where we do enforcement, is it really was the only people that you could nab and put in jail or fine were the people who were actually caught with you or running the line, and you really couldn't get to managers. So a lot of what we did, and what you probably do, is try to lobby and get the laws rewritten to allow for the owners of the factories and the people actually responsible to have some liability if they're caught.
In fact, they just did that on websites. There's a case that just came out, and they said the person that built the website knew they were selling counterfeit product, and they said, yeah, you're just as guilty as the counterfeiters. So there's kind of the message going around now, guess what, if you know and you're the website hosting, you're just as guilty. And there's legislation in House and Senate right now on rogue websites, making it much easier to take down websites that are deliberately selling counterfeit product. It's very controversial too, because it's kind of getting around First Amendment, Fourth Amendment. There was a huge article just written recently saying they thought that there weren't really any issues with it. But it was kind of, I mean, it's kind of interesting. Yeah, the organized crime, and when I've talked to people that deal with the counterfeiting, they said it's going on. And they said not only that, they're into other things because of that. Because this can now fund weapon purchases, human trafficking. It's all the same to them. It's just, it's a commodity to be moved around. Yes?
Yeah, I'm thinking of the case United States versus Dove, where the question was how much was, this was on piracy rather than counterfeiting. But they were claiming the manufacturer suggested retail price was the value of what was taken. And of course, people who will pay a dime for pirated DVD or pirated CD or pirated whatever are unlikely to pay the full manufacturer's retail price no matter what. So it's really hard to get over, how much are we really talking about? Unless you're talking about safety.
Right.
It's talking about this cash to the extent people yield the lily is apparently happening. And this discredits the whole movement of trying to crack down on counterfeiters. Then people say, oh, yeah, that's all made up, which is unfortunate.
In fact, there was a study a couple years ago looking at the film industry in Los Angeles trying to argue how much had been lost. And I'm going, how can you actually say that much was lost because there's other things that have happened? The economy is tanked. So would those films still have been made? Would those people still have been hired? And so they say, the film industry lost this amount of money and this amount of jobs. Well, that's really hard to say, and that's why anymore, other than, I almost really only consider the customs data as maybe being an indicator, but it's not the total indicator. But it's a start because you know it's actual stuff that they have touched, as opposed to guessing how many jobs, how many films would have been made, how many goods would the consumer have bought, because it's very possible that the consumer may have decided they don't want that product anymore, so they wouldn't have bought it anyway. Yeah.
I understand is attention been given, I think, of prostitution. I mean, you go after the prostitutes, and you go after the Johns. To what extent is attention being focused on the Johns, if you will?
Oh, the consumer?
Yeah, the purchasers. People are no damn well than buying.
Right now, no, but in some European countries, they are. France is really bad about it. You come across they see that Louis Vuitton bag or that Longchamp bag. If it's fake, they will take it. Not only that, they will tell the company that you were the one who brought it in, and that company can then prosecute you for it individually. Switzerland checks watches at the border. That's part of their industry. They'll say, is that a legitimate one? Yeah. Okay, how about we test it? If it's real, we'll give it back to you. If it's fake, we'll be keeping it, and not only that, fining you for bringing a fake watch into the country. And the US still has where you can bring one in. I mean, there's been some talk of nailing everybody at the border, but it's just like, okay, how much time are we going to have to spend to really go through? Yes?
I have an example where one of my friends in India got a Rolex watch gifted from his wife, and the watch was not working after some time. He went to the official Rolex store to see what's happening, and those guys replaced it. And the wife told him later that was a counterfeit watch. And the official store replaced it, seeming that's an original watch. How do you defend that? I mean, the Rolex store could not see that that's a counterfeit watch.
There is a possibility that it's so good that you can't tell. Like with
the extra shift.
Yeah.
That's the simplest solution. If it's an extra shift, it's just a serial number, and if you copy it, how do you know that there are two watches in this world with two identical serial numbers?
So what have we done as an organization? We basically created what we call an integrated project team. We've been meeting for several years. We've had people from ICE, Immigration's Custom Enforcement, Customs and Border Protection, Department of Justice, FBI, DOD, NASA, NAVAIR, NAVC, Air Force. It's basically a large group. It's industry and government, and here's kind of the things that we were talking about, you know, like, do we need standards? How do you balance the implementation of standards without sacrificing the benefits of buying commercially available product? A couple years ago, the US government moved to, let's buy more commercial off the shelf, instead of having military standards dictating what tomatoes should be, what underwear should be, what a bearing should be, what bolts should be. Instead, we'll go to commercially off the shelf, and then look at enforcement of IP properties and policies, avoiding and reducing the introduction of product into the U.S. And in 2011, we published a white paper. It is available on our website under publications. So what's the issue for aerospace? Long life cycle. We're not like the IT industry. Basically, every 18 months, you're coming out with a new product. There's also diminishing manufacturing sources. People go out of business. They no longer make the product. And material shortages. And parts obsolescence and unanticipated demand for newer developed products. So I give some examples here. We have the DC-3 went into service date in 1935. They're still flying. Believe me, there were no chips around in 1935. Sure, even some of the materials have changed. B-52 will be flying until 2040. The B-737, they're definitely still around. Southwest Airlines uses quite a bit of them. Went into service in 1968. The F-16 went in service in 1978. Retirement date's not determined. And the Space Shuttle actually did retire this year. Went into service in 1981. And what's interesting, really, if you think about the aerospace industry, is that You could have a major airline buy, doesn't matter where they are. Say they buy a 737. They decide they're going to get the newest or newer model. So they get rid of their 737s. Then you might have like a secondary, more of like a puddle hopper, buy it. Then when they're finished with it, it may go to even other countries that can't afford the brand new aircraft, but they can afford the one that's now available to them, like for instance, say in Africa, South America. So it's like you build aircraft and they stay around for a long time. And then if we look at the timeline of computer, aircraft, and systems architecture, here's basically design, production, service for computers. Airplanes, you have design, you have a long service life, and then if you look at technology, technologies could change several times over the life of that aircraft. So part of our white paper looks at, okay, what are solutions? Some of it would be, you have to really know your suppliers. You have to put procedures in place to keep the product from getting in. For instance, the Defense Logistics Agency used to just do automatic ordering of chips, microelectronic chips that need to be replaced. Now they've had to add a person there to verify that the companies really exist. Sometimes they are in someone's home. It's not to say that someone can't run a business in their home, but if you're talking about chips, they probably need a little humidity control, temperature control, and probably somebody keeping it in their garage. May even be like a mailbox's place. We have people that say they go out and check supposed suppliers. We worked with several group, a joint industry government group to develop counterfeit electronic parts where you can then require your suppliers what to do. But not only do we have, like on the military side, we also have the civilian side, which is then governed by the Federal Aviation Administration. They even have their own set of regulations, which are different than the rest of the government. And they also have a voluntary industry distributed accreditation program where you have to be accredited in order to even distribute. And sometimes when I talk to the more on the civil side, they said it's much harder to sell on the civil side than it is on the military side because they won't buy from you unless they know you. It's not to say that there aren't other products. The FAA considers unapproved product, which includes counterfeits, as suspect unapproved parts. And you can sometimes see some of the reports online. There's also reporting. Now, this is not the same as reporting to law enforcement. This may be reporting to other companies in what we consider a government industry data exchange program to say, hey, I got this product. There may be a problem with it. And then we get into arguments, is this a suspect or is this an actual counterfeit? Because if you can say it's suspected, maybe you don't have to go through all the testing because sometimes the testing, particularly on chips, can be very expensive and maybe you don't want to spend the time or money to just say, we got a suspected part. So if you report it, then other companies can go, hey, we got the same product. It's from a different company, but we know that everybody's basically all connected, so we probably do have problems with it. And then the FAA has the reporting mechanism of suspect unapproved parts. You report it to the FAA, and then they go out and investigate it and then publish a report. There's also, what do you do with counterfeit product once you get it? You certainly don't want to send it back to the person you bought it from because they'll just resell it to someone else. Well, you've bought this product, should you have to pay for it even though it's not what it's supposed to be? There's a lot of arguments on, there are a lot of the companies now saying, you know what, I bought it, it's counterfeit, I'm not only not paying for it, reporting you to enforcement, to law enforcement. And then the FAA has their own guidelines for the disposition of aircraft parts, which is basically mutilation. And then there's some of the other issues that we talked about as component obsolescence. Maybe you needed to do this at the beginning of your system. And I think this would maybe even apply to people other than aerospace. It could almost apply to any industry. What are you going to do with obsolescence? Put together a control plan which outlines your processes you will use to mitigate the risk, disposition, and reporting. Training internally, there are a lot of people in the supply chain that still don't understand what counterfeit parts are. And with regards to the duty of importers, one thing we said, Should importers be required to accurately report the authenticity of their goods? And apparently it turns out there is already something in the U.S. law that allows customs to require this. They've never put the regulations in. And one thing that's come up over the last couple years ago is that CBP should have the statutory authority to consult trademark holders for assistance in determining whether or not imported goods are authentic. Someone at CBP, and now I'm finding out it's actually Treasury, decided, okay, when you send this to the original rights holder, you should mark off certain information because it's trade secret. It's like, it can't be trade secret. You put it into the mail. It is no longer trade secret. If it's trade secret, don't mark it anywhere. But CBP said, oh, we can only send you this. We're going to mask out the rest. Now tell us if the product's legitimate. So we've been arguing about that with them, and there's actually something in the legislation to provide the full information, because when you have everything masked off, you can't tell whether or not it's even your authentic imported good. So if we look at reporting to law enforcement, here's a list of some of the people where you could report. So where do you report? To NASA, the FBI, FAA, Department of Defense, Defense Criminal Investigative Services, Customs and Border Protection, ICE, along with your local and state law enforcement. Well, one thing the U.S. Government has done is they put together National Intellectual Property Rights Coordination Center. It's located in Arlington, Virginia, and it's actually grown over the last couple of years. And these are now the organizations that are there, and they work together, basically considered a one-stop shopping for intellectual property rights if you're having an issue with violation of it, more criminally than with the civilly. And what they do is they take it in and they decide who in the group is going to work it and see if anybody else is having any issues with it. And they actually have a place now where you can report. It's actually on the internet. Some of the other things that have been going on is that there's been the Coalition Against Counterfeiting and Piracy, and then the creation a couple years ago, the White House Intellectual Property Enforcement Coordinator, known as the IPEC. The CACP was formed in 2004 by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and it's been going ever since then. We have bi-monthly meetings. We just had on Thursday one of the speakers from Homeland Security talking about the in our sites takedowns, where they had gone into websites that they knew were selling counterfeit goods, basically put up on the IP address, put up, this website's been seized, can't buy product from here. So that's what they were talking about on Thursday. There's over 700 members of the CACP, including associations and businesses. They've also published an intellectual property protection and enforcement manual, a practical legal guide. That's available on, it's actually the Global IP Center now, which is part of the chamber. That's where it's available for what I consider more smaller businesses that they need help. And here are some of their goals. Basically, the first one is the enact resolution to cut off rogue websites. They want to look at dedicated resources for IP enforcement and strengthen IP rules. The one thing people, I think, even though they say learn about the U.S. Congress, there's the one thing you have to remember is that there's authorization and appropriations. If I authorize 25 additional FBI people to work counterfeit, but I don't give you any money, doesn't matter. You got the people, but no money. So they're not going to be happening. So the problem is every year you're having to fight this budget as to make sure that you have enough resources there. Maybe you need more attorneys, maybe you need more customs people. So it's kind of an interesting thing that you're having to go through this every year. And then look at trade agreements. The Intellectual Property Enforcement Coordinator, this was created by the Pro-IP Act. This is kind of an interesting one. There are a lot of people that worked really hard to pass this legislation. Bush signed it in October 13th in 2008. It was kind of like an afterthought signature. There was no public signing on this. A lot of us were expecting that there'll be a public signing, it'll be a big deal, but instead it was just signed and that was it. Basically, to develop and implement the administration strategy for enforcement of IPR. This was signed in October 2008. It was hoped that by December 2008, before Bush left office, that someone would be in there. But Victoria Espinel was not confirmed until December 2009, which then becomes interesting because by February 2010, it's basically 2 months, they put together a notice that went in the Federal Register requesting comments on IP enforcement. They received over 1,600 comments, which they then had to go through and put together the joint strategic plan on IP enforcement. So here you have somebody comes into office December 2009. By February 2010, they have a notice in the Federal Register. By June 2010, they've gone through and analyzed 1,600 comments and come together with a plan. And then in February 2011, the President issued the executive order establishing intellectual property enforcement advisory committees. March 2011, they just came out with the white paper on what they think the Congress should be doing with regards to intellectual property enforcement. And this is all available on the whitehouse.gov OMB intellectual property. The June 2010, what's interesting out of this is it talks about a lot of the stuff that should be done. They wanted to see a U.S. government-wide working group to prevent U.S. government purchase of counterfeit products. So here you have a lot of different agencies and departments from the government coming together to say, how can we prevent this product from coming into our products that we're purchasing, or even products specifically for the U.S. government. And then in March 2011, one of the IP enforcement legislative recommendations is increase the U.S. sentencing guideline for trademark and copyright offenses when infringing products are knowingly sold for use in national defense, national security, critical infrastructure, or by law enforcement. Basically, they will bring the hammer down on you if that's where it's going. And that's it. Yes?
I would like to ask one question. If you have any data that is, in my mind, there are certain things that are at least perceived by the public as same quality and unreasonable profit margin. One can argue that this is, for example, those DVDs or CDs. I personally, in your specific area, I invented and developed and got ready to market something for general aviation that cost me to manufacture $35. There is a process called PMA that
right.
you have to go through that is required before you can actually sell it to the public. And at the end of the PMA, which was basically putting a certain stamp on it, the $35 became a $1,700 my cost. And people, when they look at things like that they perceive as inherently unfair, I believe are more likely to go for the counterfeit products. Do you have any data about things like that?
There's not specific data, but from my personal experience of actually having worked in industry, I think there are probably, this is kind of my own personal opinion, I think there are a lot of people in this country that really do not understand what manufacturing is all about. They do not understand the fact that you have to spend a lot of money to come up with a new product. Then you have to go and source it. And sometimes your supply chain may have 1,000 people in it. I mean, 1,000 different suppliers. And then there's other little things that are happening throughout the world. For instance, like there's a big stink right now about rare earths. China has escalated the prices on rare earths to the point where it's gone, I mean, it's just, in the last year, it's just exploded. You also have the other issue that's coming up right now is conflict minerals, where you're going to have to do reporting if you're buying minerals from a certain part of Africa because of other conditions that are going on. So I think there are issues with people not really understanding manufacturing. It's not that simple that oh, I came up with this great product, now I'm gonna make it, now I gotta find trained employees to make the product. I've gotta figure out how I'm going to get it where it's going to go. And on the flip side, I've also heard of people in California that don't understand farming.
But do you see
They don't
a
understand how
difference?
product comes from a farm to their grocery store. They just think it magically appears.
But do you see a difference? Do you see a difference in those areas where there is at least a perception of basic unfairness in the pricing of the products?
I think that probably a lot of people figure whatever you pay is too much anyway. It doesn't matter what you sell it for, it's too much. You shouldn't be making that kind of money. There's some of those thoughts out there, and I think there are a lot of people that don't understand. I mean, you can even argue the same thing about attorneys. There are probably a lot of people that say attorneys make too much money, not realizing all the other things that go into it. So it's difficult. I think there's some perceptions out there that a lot of the public has gotten away from.
Kirsten,
Yes.
can I say something about that?
Sure.
I know what you're getting at. I think you're right. We always have a perception about price and value when we buy something. And you know, if I'm buying helicopter blades, I'll pay whatever is necessary because if they break, I'm going down. But something where I don't perceive a great value, but the price is tremendous, I think breeds the opportunity for counterfeiting. That's the ideal situation.
That's one part, and the other part is when there is, I mean, if you're looking at the CD industry, and the music industry, the most common response that you get from both the consumers and to some extent, basically from everybody that is in this business of copying, counterfeiting, pirating, is that the pricing is inherently unfair. It's just, and that is what is pushing the public to go and really go and pay for this counterfeited, or just not pay for the counterfeited goods, and yet when you're coming to go and try to enforce it, try to create the legislation to enforce it, there's going to be a price to pay on the political side because of this huge, well, the huge difference does exist. I mean, I understand exactly, for example, what you said about the manufacturing. In my case, I happen to know about what does it take, and moving from $35 to $1,700 could not be justified, and I knew that if I make it, there was no question in my mind that it wouldn't take long before somebody will counterfeit it. And the truth is that I could understand why. It's very hard to sell something like that for $1,700. People will make a counterfeit. And the question is, how much of it, if you see that parts of those industries are driven by, or not part of the industry, but sorry, parts of the problem are driven by these huge discrepancies, is it a better idea for those critical embodiments of those critical implementations, such as aircraft parts, to separate themselves from those that basically do create this huge profit if they want to get legislation that people will agree with?
Because if we go back to the survey, product 11 cents to $1 being counterfeited. Why? Because there's a market there. And even 101 to $500. I mean, even the highest number is between $1 and $10 is what's being counterfeited. That's not even a high-priced product.
Okay, that's a good
Yeah.
answer.
Yeah. Tom?
I'm not sure what's driving the difference between 35 and 1,700, but if it's regulatory overhead, think about a pill, and maybe this pill has to recover the cost of a couple $100 million back to the customer.
Yeah.
And and it's being sold for, $1.50, and maybe it costs a penny to make it. The difference between the $1.50 and the penny is the regulatory element. That's got to be recovered, except the counterfeiter only has to pay the penny and a half. And so if he can sell it for, 10 and a half cents, he's making a nice profit and kicking the crap out of the person who more than regulatory element. There's no easy solution to that. We certainly can't get rid of the Food Drug Administration because it adds too damn much to the price of drugs. But that's exactly the same kind of thing that it's driving Harry Watson. Our drugs are too expensive. People need them, they can't afford them. Okay, let's get rid of the Food Drug Administration. We'll have cheap drugs. They may not work. We'll have them.
Thanks a lot, Christian.